Welcome to the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of RocketPD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
The last thing everybody hears. So I try to make the point that family engagement is not about more. It's about doing what we already do differently.
Dr. Steve Constantino is the author of Engage Every Family and one of the nation's most respected researchers on the topic of family engagement. His 5 simple principles logic model has become foundational to family engagement strategies in thousands of U.S. K-12 school districts.
I'm reminded of the old business analyst Peter Drucker, who said, if you want to start something new, you're going to have to stop something old. And so this shift in thinking and this change in the way we operate in terms of engagement, I think can be extremely beneficial to seeing success. And how do we measure success in family engagement? Student experiences in school.
But there's a difference between family engagement theory, which nearly everyone can agree is important, and actual practice. In this episode of the RocketPD Podcast, I talk with Steve about what it means to do the work and how a commitment to family engagement, done right, can help administrators address problems from chronic absenteeism to student discipline to MTSS to lingering learning gaps and everything in between.
Whatever our goals are, if it's absenteeism or if it's test scores or if it's behaviors or whatever the case may be, do we see improvements in those areas as a result of our efforts in family engagement? When you can show that kind of data, lots of educators start to pay attention and get excited about that.
At the end, Steve talks about a group that he's pulling together with his writing partner Peggy to make family engagement stick in schools. Don't miss it. Hey, Steve, great to talk to you. It's been a while, so good to have you back. I know we're talking about family engagement today, and before we got on, you and I were talking about this idea of sort of broader family engagement, but then specifically around how we can use family engagement to tackle some challenges like chronic absenteeism, to tackle things like, discipline in schools, a lack of parent engagement, MTSS and some of this stuff, right? There's a lot of things that folks are dealing with. And I think they're starting to realize, or maybe they have realized for a long time, but they're kind of coming back to it, this notion that family engagement can in a lot of ways be a tool for them. Can we talk a little bit about, just this idea of when you're engaging families, how it helps you maybe tackle some of these challenges and these problems that you're facing?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, to respond to some of the things you said about in your comments, we've known for over 50 years now about the research in family engagement and what that can do to enhance students' experiences in school, whether those experiences are academic or whether those experiences fall under the heading of social emotional learning. And the other thing that popped into my head was, something I wrote at the beginning of Engage Every Family. And I use it a lot in saying that if we as educators could successfully teach all children by ourselves, then it seems to me we would have already done it. So I'm not so sure that, how much more evidence we need to understand that family engagement is a critical piece of the school improvement and school success process. I'm not going to turn this into a research seminar because everyone will shut it off. But, if you line up 5 or 6 of the major studies about school improvement and leadership and all of the components, every one of those studies says that a core component must be family and community engagement. And so hopefully, since the pandemic and since things got turned upside down, I think folks are thinking differently now about how we can achieve the success that we desire. I also think, too, that the comments about attaching family engagement to specifics, and what I mean by specifics, of course, are the are the challenges that educators face. Chronic absenteeism is one that I hear everywhere I go, no matter if I'm in rural America or urban America. Chronic absenteeism seems to be at the top of, or near the top of everyone's list of challenges to try and overcome. We know for a fact that there are ways in which we can engage families that improve student attendance to school. We will talk about the socialization of families. The research term is family academic socialization, but the key point there is to socialize families to the importance of what's happening in school. We tend to report, and again, I don't want to make blanket statements, but we tend to, as educators, report what's happened. When we post grades to a student information system, it's a wonderful vehicle for communication, but we have to remember that we're posting information that has already occurred. Elementary schools and weekly folders, the work that parents get back, here's some examples of what your child did in school. Though the operative word is did. So we need to shift our thinking to how do we engage families with what's happening and what's going to happen, as opposed to here's what happened. And so that's just one area. I think when we look at student behaviors in school and student interventions in school, if we're looking at MTSS systems, and I know that there are different variations of that from state to state, but every one of them has a wonderful way in which we can engage with families. I often, when I work with families or meet with families, I ask them to tell me, please raise your hand if you've ever heard the term MTSS. And nobody raises their hand. I said, well, then I don't have to ask my second question, which is, what does MTSS mean? If you've never heard of it, you don't know what it means. So there are lots of opportunities to engage folks with what we are doing. And the more we do that, the more research says that we socialize families, and they in turn will socialize their own children. One important point about all of that is this. We know this is not even a debated question anymore. We know that families are the first and most influential teachers of their children. So it stands to reason then that if we can influence them with information about what's occurring and what's going to occur in school, they in turn, and the term again is socialize their own child to its importance as well. So I think there's a lot of natural connections and a lot of natural fit when we talk about MTSS and chronic absenteeism, issues in special education. All of those have golden opportunities to engage families, perhaps differently than we have in the past, but engage them nonetheless.
So we're operating under this belief that family engagement done well, right, can be a tool to help us solve urgent problems within our school system, chronic absenteeism being one. But there's a difference between saying we want to engage families, maybe putting that in our strategic plan as a, quote, priority, and actually doing it well. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between those two things, because I do think sometimes what you get is a lot of lip service to family engagement, at least up front. But then when you go out and you talk to parents, or you look at message boards or wherever else they're talking to each other, the rhetoric doesn't always reflect the reality there.
Yeah. And I think we need to start with the idea that we have lots of engaged families. And when we talk about this topic, we are really talking about families who, for whatever reason, and we could spend the rest of the day talking about those reasons, but for whatever reason, are disengaged or feel disenfranchised or feel marginalized. And again, that happens over time. There's situations, we don't have time to get into all that. So we're not talking about 100% of the population. We're talking about a smaller subset of families whom we can then focus on. Engaged families, and sometimes I joke and say we even have the overly engaged families. Folks could probably take a few days off and it'd be okay. But I'm not going to worry too much about the engaged families who are on top of what's happening, who understand the importance of school and yada, 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 yada. It's the disengaged families and the issues that are facing those kinds of families. We tend to see correlations, and I hesitate to make a blanket statement. But when we look at socioeconomically disadvantaged students in school, there's some relationship between that and the level of disengagement of families. And so I think it's important, first of all, to remember that we're not going out to try to change 100% of the people. That number is different in different places. I think, secondly, it's important to remember that, again, this is pretty much an accepted idea in research over the years, is that every family desires that their child exceed them in their quality of life, regardless of how they perhaps behave or don't behave or attend or don't attend. I think it's an important point to remember, because so often I hear, well, these families didn't attend this event, so they must not care. And then that idea of apathy becomes, kind of the driving force in our attitude about family engagement. And that's not really it. There are a number of barriers to family engagement. Apathy is rarely one of them. I don't know that I've ever met a parent who sat across from me and said, I don't care what happens to my kid. I don't care how he does in school. I'm not suggesting that there aren't people out there that think that, but certainly it is not the majority of families. We find that families who are disengaged or disenfranchised often have the sense that we don't want them engaged, or that we have created a system that they can't navigate. And so the solutions to some of that is fairly simple. But it does call for a different way of thinking about family engagement. You mentioned, strategic. I've read a number of strategic plans in my life, and they all are wonderful plans. And when I get to the family engagement piece, most say the same thing, that we want to engage more parents with stuff. We want more parents to come to this or come to that. We want to increase the number of people involved in our parent-teacher association or homeschool association, whatever the name is. And those are wonderful goals, but I think it's important to remember that family engagement is a process, not an event.
Yeah.
And I think that's a shift that we have to make in our thinking, that because somebody doesn't come to something or cannot come to something doesn't mean that they're apathetic, doesn't mean that they don't want to. We just have to find different ways. And we have had a lot of success, as you know, over the years, helping schools and school districts understand what that looks like. And understanding too, and for all of the teachers who are listening to this, I say this always up front, family engagement should never be about more. I say jokingly when I'm working with teachers, it would be insane of me to walk into a room full of teachers and say, hey, I've got a great idea for you, and it's only going to take about 10 more hours a week. That would be it. That would be the last thing everybody hears. So I try to make the point that family engagement is not about more. It's about doing what we already do differently. I'm reminded of the old business analyst, Peter Drucker, who said, if you want to start something new, you're going to have to stop something old. And so this shift in thinking and this change in the way we operate in terms of engagement, I think can be extremely beneficial to seeing success. And how do we measure success in family engagement? Student experiences in school. Whatever our goals are, if it's absenteeism or if it's test scores or if it's behaviors or whatever the case may be, do we see improvements in those areas as a result of our efforts in family engagement? When you can show that kind of data, lots of educators start to pay attention and get excited about that.
That's cool. Now I know, you have Engage Every Family, which with the 5 principles has been a book that's been talked about a lot, and we've spent a lot of time walking people through those 5 simple principles. And more recently, you've released a case study book where you're actually giving some examples of folks that are doing this work and what that looks like in context. Because you have those case studies, right, and you've been there and you've seen it and you've written about this, I'd love for you to give me a couple of examples of, all right, what is this? I want to visualize how family engagement done right looks different in a school system.
Yeah. So the new book, Case Studies to Engage Every Family, contains 20 case studies, all correlated to the 5 principles that you mentioned. And every one of the case studies is, I hope, and the feedback we're getting is, wow, these things really do happen. Sometimes I feel like, the television show that we took these ideas and we ripped them from the headlines, things that actually happen. And there's 2 different kinds of case studies, which I think are important. Some of the case studies set up a problem, obviously, a challenge, something that goes wrong. But some of the case studies are just the opposite. It's case studies about what went right. And we have seen already that when we get to work with teachers and the case studies are very short, they can be read in less than 5 or 6 minutes. They're designed that way because educators are busy. But we also take you through a process to say, okay, how did this happen? Why do you think this happened? And what could we do to get a different outcome? And I think I've always enjoyed case study analysis because it really brings reality to theory. We can read about theories all day long. There's lots of research that we can bury ourselves up to our nose in. But at the end of the day, I think what's popular about the case studies is that they are real stories. They're things that really happen in schools every day. And I have yet to have any educators say, "Well, these things are preposterous." All of the feedback that I can think of at the moment is like, "My gosh, this happened in our school last week."
Yeah,
and so we use those case studies to make those changes, to make those nuanced changes in how we go about engaging families and what that might look like. And there's all kinds of stories in there. There's a story about a student who gets suspended from school, whose parent gets upset. There's a story about an elementary teacher who makes a home visit to a difficult family. There are stories about principals and even superintendents. We have a few that are on the district level because when we work with districts, budgets and bond issues and why the community is not supporting something. So we've tried to really run the gamut of all of these. Of course, the book would be 700 pages if we were to take every story, but it's designed to be quick. Just like Engage Every Family, if a group of people have 20 minutes, there's a lot you could do to think about. Here's something. And then we actually give you the opportunity in the book to relate it to your own school. And we ask the question, has anything like this ever happened? Or can you think of something similar? And again, almost every time somebody said, yeah, not only similar, but exactly,
yeah,
exactly what happened in the case study. So I think from that point of view, they're becoming very popular because it's allowing educators to see, okay, these things happen, and here is a process that we can implement to try to change these outcomes.
Yeah,
and by doing not more, but doing some things differently.
Well, I love how you said, I think this is a great way of thinking about it, right? Because I don't think people always get this, but, family engagement is not an event. It's a process, right? So you might say, well, I held this event for parents at my school and we only got 15 people. So, my family engagement isn't working. And you might say, well, that's one data point, right? But what is your larger process and plan for family engagement? And how do you do that in your school system? And if people don't understand the difference between event and process and put the work in, right, to get
Yeah.
that process, they're probably not going to move the needle.
Here's the way I usually, and well, you know me well enough to know that there are many times when I get myself in trouble with my mouth. But let me, at the risk of alienating the audience, I don't think I'll do that. Most educators, I would hope, know what the instructional process is. You know, we all learned it in college. We know that there are state standards, and there's curriculum, and there's materials, and there's methodology and pedagogy and assessment. And we all know that in order to make something better in school, we have to follow some sort of a process. And so if I asked a group of third grade teachers, and I present this sometimes in workshops, I say, I'm the superintendent, and I just looked at the quarterly benchmark scores. And I saw that we took a dip in reading comprehension. And so I come to the teachers and say, can you take a look at this and make some suggestions as to what we could do to try to get back on track with reading comprehension? And what those teachers are going to do is they're going to, first of all, look at the standard and look at the alignment of the standard to the curriculum, and look at the alignment from the curriculum to the methodology, look at methodologies in classrooms, look at assessments, look at the larger scope of pedagogy. And they're going to look at that process to say, okay, here's where we can make some changes so that hopefully the next time we assess students, things will be better. So that's a process. But if I go to a group of people and say, I want to improve family engagement, it's very common for people to say, well, we need to get more people to come to something. Mm-hmm. And the point that I make is that you wouldn't do that to improve reading, and you shouldn't do that to improve family engagement. We need to understand, that there's a process in place. I hear all the time, we have academic nights. That's a big thing. I know that Title I schools are required to do them. We have all these events, and there's always some lamenting about either the people who show up are the parents of the kids who are doing just fine, or they don't get the attendance that they want. And my question has always been, you know me well enough to know that, one of my favorite phrases is ROI, return on investment. If you want me to do something, I want to know what is my return on investment. And so I ask a very simple question. As a result of an academic night or a series of academic nights that you might plan, do you have any data or evidence to show that math or the academic performance, math, English, whatever it is, do you have any evidence to show that achievement went up as a result of that event? I have yet to have anybody tell me that they have that data. Now, I'm not saying, again, it's maybe somebody listening to this will say, well, let me send you my data. That'd be great. But more often than not, there's a disconnect between this event and what we're trying to accomplish with student performance in school. And so I think the time has come to rethink that, and sometimes I get labeled an event basher, and that's not it.
Right.
But if we're going to ask teachers to give up a great deal of their time, their energy, and their resources to do these things, then we ought to figure out a way in which we can see some kind of result. And when we do that, maybe those events would become part of a bigger plan. And again, those are things that we talk about all the time, but those are the kinds of shifts in thinking, the kinds of changes I think that we can make that, are not asking for more, but just rethinking how we do this whole family engagement thing.
I heard you mention something earlier, and there was this idea of, and I wrote down, turning the camera around, right, or turning the lens around, because this idea that we see the way parents react to something, and we categorize that probably unfairly, or don't react to something, and we categorize that probably unfairly as apathy. But the reality is there's probably another reason for why they are acting the way that they are, and it has something to do with how our system is engaging or not engaging with them. So can you give me some of those reasons why a parent might feel that way? Why are parents disengaged, right? And then how do we think through those challenges as an institution and maybe change our way of thinking as opposed to expecting parents to change, which maybe isn't quite fair?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an easy answer to that question, because that's a 3-hour workshop, Corey. We have identified there are numerous reasons for disengagement. One of them can be time. Parents who perhaps are working more than one job, who are, mom or dad works a different shift and one of them has to be home all the time, or there's only a single parent. The time can be a great barrier. Uncertainty is one of the biggest barriers. We tend to think, we make an assumption as educators that parents understand what we give to them. And one of the points when we communicate something, and one of the points that I always make is, in order for communication to take place, we have to have evidence that the message was received, which is pretty easy. We can check a website, see how many people open their email. We can have them sign a piece of paper and send it back. We're pretty good at that. But the second litmus test to that is we also have to have evidence that the communication was understood. And that uncertainty about, if I get a flyer home that says there's something going on Thursday night, we are making an assumption that every parent understands what it is, why we're doing it, and the relationship to their own child and why it's important to them. We just make that assumption. Well, assumptions are dangerous things in organizations. And so we need to look at things a little bit differently. Do we have mechanisms for parents to feed back? The terms that I use all the time, in order for someone to engage with something, and this is beyond family engagement, this is just engagement research. In order to get someone to engage with something, we have to make sure that they see the meaningful nature of it and the relevance to them. If a person doesn't see those two things, the likelihood of them engaging is going to drop significantly. Culture and language can be a barrier. Parental experiences, their own experiences in school. If mom or dad didn't have a pleasant experience, they're probably not going to, they may even be socializing their child to an unpleasant experience, number one, but they're probably not going to participate. We know from research that disengaged families often feel judged by the schools, and again, those are perceptions that research has clearly shown us over the years. And so we actually have a model of disengagement that we share with folks to say, here's how it happens, and here's how we can, for lack of a better metaphor, put a screwdriver in the gears to stop it and to see if we can't reverse it and go the other way. So all of these, uncertainty and time and parental experiences themselves, parents who didn't finish school, parents who didn't go on to college, there's many families who feel inferior to the school, who aren't going to talk to the teacher or the principal because they don't feel that they're on the same level. Again, those are a few examples of a number of barriers that can be there, and we need to recognize them. And we also need to recognize that some of the barriers we've created. We've created with practices and procedures and policies that we've put into place that don't necessarily promote engagement, could actually be working against us in terms of getting more families to be engaged with their children's learning. Last thing I'll say is that there's a difference between the word communication and engagement. There's also a difference between the words engagement and involvement. One can be involved and not engaged. And I think that 25 years ago, when we were looking at research, it was parent involvement research. That has now morphed into family engagement research because we've learned over time that those are two very different things.
Yeah. I want to take this back to this idea at the outset of chronic absenteeism for a second, because you've hit on something that's really interesting, which is communication and engagement are two different things, right? For example, I'm not successful at family engagement if I just go to parents and I tell them, hey, your child's been absent for the last 5 days. We need them back in school. That's not family engagement. That might be a notice that I send or some communication, but the engagement happens well before you get to that point where the student is potentially missing a lot of school. So, how do we lay the foundation to make sure that we're not trying to solve a problem like family engagement at the point of that problem, right? But we're going way back to make sure that we're solving for it at the root, which would be some of those things that you just described.
Yeah, in all my years in education, and they were a lot, sent a lot of letters home about chronic absenteeism, the 3-day letter, the 5-day letter, and the letters would intensify. When you got to the 10-day letter, we waived the fact that we might file a petition in court in front of you. And I don't recall any of that ever working. I don't recall any of that ever having any kind of a positive impact on absenteeism. I think the other, without going too deeply into this, I think there's a lot of us in education who feel or felt that a student attendance to school is controlled by their family, and so when ESSA came along and many states used chronic absenteeism as a measurement, there was a lot of pushback that said, hey, wait a minute, you're asking us to be accountable for something that we can't control. Well, that's not exactly true. I think if you really look at what the science and the research and the empirical studies have said, is that the responsibility for chronic absenteeism rests with both parties. One or the other isn't going to fix it. Yeah. It's going to have to be some sort of a combination of families and community and the school. And it's a very different look at how we can tackle a pretty big problem. I don't know that I've been to any school or any district, in the last few years, which hasn't rated chronic absenteeism amongst one of their biggest challenges. And I think you're right. We have to go back to the root. There's no quick fix for this. There are people out there that would give me a strategy. Give me a strategy that I can use tomorrow and solve this problem. I don't have one. What I do have is an opportunity to go back, as you said, and look at the root cause of some of these issues and start a new process that if we are patient, we can't expect, chronic absenteeism solved, check, move to the next problem. That's right. Not going to happen. But we should be able to start to see incremental improvement. And that incremental improvement over time becomes more and more and more. And hopefully, we hit Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. There's lots of success stories out there about schools that have, had some significant absenteeism problems, significant dropout problems, and have done very well with, again, to use an educational metaphor, to kind of clear the whiteboard and start again.
Yeah.
And talk about why is a student absent? Their parent doesn't make them go to school. That could be. There also could be something else. There could be something on our side of the fence that is prohibiting attendance as well. So again, that's I can't go. Obviously, don't have the time to go in too deeply to that, but it does call for a rethinking of how we approach the issues.
So that's fantastic, and it's a good segue too, because we can't go into all of this right now. We don't have the time, but I know that you're pulling a group together this fall. You and your writing partner, Dr. Peggy Constantino, are pulling a group together this fall to talk about family engagement as a process, to talk about how to use it as a tool to solve those challenges, those systemic challenges like chronic absenteeism and others. Tell me a little bit about the group you're pulling together and what you guys are going to, attempt to tackle.
Attempt to tackle. We have grand ideas, so we'll see what happens. I think the big shift in, we've done cohorts before. And the work that we have done in previous years has always been to explore into a deeper level the 5 principles, that process of family engagement and what that might look like. This time, and this really came about as a result of feedback from educators and questions and conversations that I have with folks all over the country. This time we're taking a very different approach. We're saying, okay, here's a challenge for a school. And again, we're kind of focused on chronic absenteeism. Where in the 5 principles do we need to look in order to begin to resolve that problem? And what might that resolution look like? The same thing for behaviors and discipline, MTSS, special education. So we're, for lack of a better term, we're taking a more topical approach by leading with, here are some challenges that educators said that they're having in schools, and here's where family engagement fits, and this is how it might look, to try to give you that visual of the change that might be necessary. And so each one of the 5 sessions is going to focus on a different challenge. And again, we got the ideas largely from educators who said, "Boy, I'd love to learn more about this and this and this and this." Okay, well, let's. There's plenty of research and practical application for this, and so we're designing 5 90-minute sessions, virtual sessions, to help educators explore. And it doesn't, whether you're a teacher or a counselor, a family engagement specialist, a principal, an assistant superintendent, a federal programs director. It doesn't really matter who you are, because I think that the information is going to be relevant. And I'm taking a little bit of my own advice and saying, how do we make family engagement more meaningful and relevant? And I think, this idea of using the topics as the gateway.
Yeah.
Is a good idea. We'll see what happens, but we're pretty excited about it.
Well, very cool. I know you've got a big group already. If you guys are interested in learning about that, I will drop the link if you're watching this video on YouTube into the comments. If you're listening on a podcast channel, you can check out the details at RocketPD.com. Hey, Steve, I want to thank you. And really quick, I wanted to kind of ask you this last question, which was, I know you didn't hatch out of the egg as a family engagement expert and researcher. You started your career in education as a band teacher, right? So what advice would you kind of give your former self or some of the teachers and folks watching here who are feeling a little overwhelmed with the prospect of having to go out there and engage these families and bring them back into the conversation?
Well, and again, we don't, everyone knows my story. You're right. I didn't wake up one day and decide I'm going to write some books on family engagement and become an authority in the topic. It was really more out of necessity of looking at challenges that faced a large comprehensive high school and learning about how family engagement might help those issues, and then having great success as a result of it. And it was really that success that started all this. People started knocking on the doors and saying, "How'd you do that?" And so I would say to everyone that family engagement is an important, necessary component to any kind of improvement or success planning that we're doing. It's not a nice to have. It's a have to have. And I also know that it seems impossible sometimes. I know that people who are watching or listening to this will immediately think of a couple of parents who you don't believe will ever be engaged, or you think is hopeless. And I would ask you not to think that way. I would ask you to remember that something is in the way. And if we can figure out what that barrier is, we can get around it or over it or under it or through it. And you can line up success story after success story. But to think of family engagement as integral to what we do, to have a family's perspective, if we're looking at making a decision, for example, let's not do that in the isolation of families. Do we have their voice? Do we know what families think? Do we even know they understand what the challenge is? And how can we better do that? So I hope that sometimes I lament about family engagement being boiled down to 10 strategies. Here's 10 things you can do to engage everybody tomorrow. I've never seen that work because at the root, as you mentioned, and I liked your term, at the root of this is an organizational culture issue. And those kinds of issues are not fixed overnight.
Yeah.
So if we can keep it in the forefront of our mind, if we can keep our mind open to this being integral and essential, I think we can see success.
That's great. Steve, I want to thank you again for chatting with us for a
My
little
pleasure.
bit.
Thank you.
Guys, again, if you are interested, I will drop those links down below in the comments. And also you can check out the information at RocketPD.com. If you're listening, Steve, just want to say thanks again.
Thank
everybody. We'll see you again on the next episode real soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the RocketPD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the RocketPD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for RocketPD. At RocketPD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at RocketPD.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.